everybody, and thank you for joining this first webinar. As Vasco say, welcome back to Cambridge. I'm going to talk about ongoing work with a researcher at the Federal Reserve Board in Washington. Interestingly, we have been working on many things, but this paper came out of work on global warming. So we had an integrated model with the global warming and the economy over a space of 10 years. And we realized that the structure was actually suitable to talk about this crisis over the space of 4 weeks, which was sort of a first shocking realization of how much this crisis is basically challenging everything we think we know about crisis. There are many common patterns, but lots of new things. I should start saying that this is joint work with Martin Bodenstein, Luca Guerrieri at the Fed, and therefore immediately I should put this disclaimer out, saying that in no way we represent the views and the opinions of the Federal Reserve Board or the Federal Reserve System. Also, you can find the full paper, both in Cambridge-INET and at the Fed. So the questions we are asking are pretty much, very much on I read newspaper. On the one hand, can we avoid the economic cost of the COVID by simply not doing the lockdown? Or if we want to think about the lockdown, is there a way in which the lockdown can be smart, can be improving the trade-off between the healthcare and the lives and the economy. Now we know that basically the main argument for a lockdown is the concern that since the healthcare system are constrained, by stressing the healthcare system, the mortality rate could actually skyrocket. So there was like there was a concern about mortality rate. What we are going to show, I'm going to tell you that there are also lots of risks, economic risks, in letting and what we learn from the economy and epidemiology can be used to actually think ways to contain these costs. So this is a very ambitious outline. The slides will be distributed, and you can see them. I guess, on your own. So I just pick and choose a few of them. I'll talk about this integrated assessment model that we use. I touch upon the economic cost of not having a lockdown or lifting the lockdown too soon. And the idea of structural measures that I was talking before, that you'll see comes down to really protect the essential workers in the economy. I'll be more clear about that. And then if we have time, something about waiting for a vaccine or testing. Everything I say is related to the US economy. At this stage, everything I say is deterministic. We don't put any stochastic measure. There is a huge literature. We are not only the only ones to do this. Every day there are papers. We even created a real-time journal called COVID Economics. If you don't know it, it would be good for you to see it together with our Cambridge-INET website. There is also a link to the COVID Economics, where I can tell you, I'm the editorial board. We have hundreds of submissions every week. We try to come up twice a week. But you see, all this combine economics with epidemiology. So coming back to the main question, I want to tell you immediately, I'm going to talk about supply disruption, and I'm going to talk about supply disruptions linked to the possibility of a huge dent in the labor supply due to the illness, in part because people may become symptomatic and unable to work, in part because they may want to stay home to take care of their families, or they are simply in fear of getting sick. So this is not to deny that there is an enormous demand effect out there, both in terms of sectoral demand, and also in terms of the financial shock, permanent income, increasing unemployment rates, inequality. Again, in our website, you'll find a lot of studies about that. Despite unprecedented monetary fiscal expansion that we are trying to do now, this will present a bill, a very large bill in the future. But at this stage, what I really think is that we should really focus on the supply part and on the lockdown, because much of this demand, terrible demand effect, will depend on the way we are dealing with the lockdown by disruption. Not to deny that there is a demand side. I'm very concerned about that. So how do we think about the integrated assessment model? We really need a rich model where the epidemiology tell us about the contact rates, infection, tell us about the mortality rates, by demographics, also by region, also geographical. And however, this is not enough. We need to combine it with a macroeconomic model that faces a particular challenges. This is not a small shock, it's a very large shock. So in a way, we need to take care of the possibility, you know, we use in models, sometimes we go for linearization. So we always think of shocks as business cycle as usual. This is not business cycle as usual. So one way to think about a macroeconomic model dealing with large shock, we went back in the Cambridge tradition of input-output sectoral links, and we are trying to ask seriously, what would be the set of industries that we could consider essential industry, the core sector, something that we think could be very labor intensive, so exposed to the COVID crisis, and they produce by definition essential inputs, so something that is low substitutability, cannot be substituted out very quickly. And also we need to think of occupational tasks, because basically in this crisis will tell us who can work from home, who can work in a situation minimizing the contact with other people. So we are working on a large list of occupational tasks and combining in the macroeconomic model. And then we want a model that sort of captures vulnerabilities. So the idea would be that there are certain tasks, certain services that cannot be run without a minimum amount of workers. There is some kind of minimum scale production. We are thinking about, you know, like transportation system, hospitals, or like distribution. You need a minimum scale production. And then we want to have realistic feature in the economy, like capacity utilization, reversible investment. For this, we can count on the Fed and the tradition of academic papers. So we just use a state-of-the-art model in that. So I'm going to be very simple. I'm not using all of these elements, but I want to call attention that out of this complexity comes a very simple argument for structuring measures, mostly thinking of sector and industry, occupational task, and age. So let me show you a little bit the way we think about it. So the problem is COVID. I say this is stupid, but it needs to be said because some people think now that the problem is the lockdown. No. The problem is the pandemic. That from the pandemic, you have health measures that may be voluntary or spontaneous with the behavior, and this creates a trade-off between the economy and health. Now, this health measure, the reason to have an integrated assessment model is because you want to have lessons, combining lessons from the economic side, core, non-core sector, occupational tasks, rate. This is like an important element. So let me go very quickly on what is the contribution. So core sector, essential workers. This is actually a much more difficult question than you think. And in our view, actually, there could be large surprises when we run this crisis through this course, because, you know, there could be that we don't think about it and become like bottlenecks in the economy. But a typical definition of the core sector is what you see here for the US. So it's something like combining agriculture, utilities, food and beverage, through healthcare, governments, think about the police. And all this amounts to more or less 30% of GDP and almost 40% of employment. Now, what does the data tell us about the core sector? The core workers are more out there, are more exposed to contacts and contagion. So in the US, the core sector employ 25% of population. Of these, only 15% can work from home. If you look at the non-core sector, employing 40% of the population. Of these, 40% can work from home. So we start to think about, the idea that the essential workers are out there. When they go to work, they commute. When they go shopping, when they're in the workplace, they have an intensive contact that makes them more exposed to the disease. So the idea was to think of these groups as separate target for social distancing. So let me refer to group 1 as core worker, group 2 as non-core workers, and group 3 as the rest of the population, basically out of the labor force, young and elder. Now, what do we learn from the epidemiological model? Here, let me tell you immediately, we are trying to take a midway among all the possible estimates. And on this, I can tell you there is a very large, you may know from reading the paper, there is very large uncertainty. But we are on the green side. We want to take a little bit of conservative approach. So we have a daily contact rate of 0.2 in absence of social distancing that imply a famous R0, the reproduction rate of 4. Now, if you look at the literature, this goes from 1.5 to 6, but this is sort of our midpoint that allows us to understand more flexibly the possible scenario. We also use, we need to ask basically how many people will be symptomatic and therefore once ill, unable to go to work. And this is basically, we take the data from the Diamond Princess cruise. There are many other studies around, and after weeks of discussion with epidemiologists, basically we go back to the origin. The Diamond Princess, horribly was an important lab for all the work that we are using in this literature. We are not going to show you death rates. We actually, the recovery here is only people who get well. It's just to simplify the analysis. I also want to call attention to the fact that how much you are in contact with other people depends a lot on your age. The contact metrics within community from the US, that you see immediately the age group, basically the contact rate goes down pretty much with age, remains high until 50. But what is also important, there is a lot of cross, like off diagonal contact rates, meaning that people below 50 tend to be around and have a strong contact with everybody else. Those off diagonal elements are very important for us because, we always think of this disease as protecting the people who needs protection because old or with previous vulnerability. But there is also the other aspect of it, which is if you let the young out, they are going to spread the virus. There is a strong infection externality. So a way to protect the vulnerable is not only to lock them up, but also to reduce the opportunity to run into the others who can be asymptomatic but carrying the virus. So to make a long story short, I think I have a few minutes left. I want to just run through the exercise. The first of which is to ask the question, suppose we had no lockdown, okay? And we just run the infection pickup and get in 3 months about a peak, according to the epidemiological model, a peak of almost 35% of the population, of the working population infected, okay? So you see that if I distinguish people in the core and non-core sector, the core sector, the peak of infection is much higher because those are the people who are more out there. They are like, they have more exposure to the infection. So one first element from the analysis is that if you consider the risk and go up, unabated, you see from this graph you see from this graph, the blue line is the two-sector model, our model with core and non-core. The red one is a one-sector model, ignoring essential workers. You see that once you start to hit the essential industries, the economic damage can be much, much larger. It hits capacity utilization, it hits investment, it hits consumption, because all of a sudden you have supply disruption that become binding. Now, the idea is very clear here, just like in words. And for us, this was a way to reinforce the other argument in favor of the lockdown, which is basically to avoid stressing the healthcare system and increase mortality rate. Now, just to make clear, this is something that my wife always asking me. So what if people simply get scared and do not come out, even in the absence of a lockdown? You will have spontaneous social distancing. Would the economic cost be lower? Well, the answer is actually the other way around. The economic cost could be larger because, with an unabated increase in infection rate and mortality rates, many people simply may decide not to go to work. So the behavioral system, instead of smoothing the infection, simply smoothing the infection rate, may actually exacerbate the supply shortages. So let me go quickly towards what I want to say. First, I told you that we take a grim position, assuming a large contact rate here, a large reproduction rate. But you see, our estimates are basically flat when we change the contact rates until we hit basically R0 around 2 or below 2. So this is the part in which actually a miracle can occur if this virus become less pernicious, no less infective, and or like we guess a way of conduct our life that reduces the exposure. For everything else, the problem still in our estimates is still there. Let me conclude with the idea of that we then structure in the paper. So the idea would be to say, let's make an experiment. Suppose that we start locking up, impose a lockdown on people who can work from home. Locking up means that they cannot go out. They will not go shopping. They will not go commuting. They just stay home, okay? So it would be 15% in group 1 and 40% group 3, old, basically elderly and young. Now, if we start with these numbers, you need to have a lockdown in place for 8 months to avoid a new peak of the disease, not to create a very slow acquisition of herd immunity over time. So if we do this experiment on the right-hand side, on the right column of this, I think I'm running out of time, like on the right column of this figure, you see that we smooth out the infection rate quite a bit. But in terms of output, what we do, we smooth out the cost in terms of output, capacity utilization, investment, consumption is better, but in terms of output, the economic cost is smoothed out, not necessarily much smaller. So there is a sense in which the lockdown per se is not. So first of all, this kind of lockdown is, in our view, the most efficient we can have. But simply locking up people who can start working from home may not be enough. Now, there are ways in which it can go wrong, but let me stress to come to a conclusion the major point of this exercise. So this exercise shows that basically you could have a smart lockdown by combining the need to protect basically the elderly with the need to protect the essential worker. And the way you protect the essential worker is basically by reducing the contacts that they can have while they perform their task. So in the slides, you'll see that the idea that you could have a stronger lockdown, but short, is actually not that great, because you create a lot of problem in the short run, and then the fact that the lockdown is very strict, basically you prevent herd immunity. When you open up again, you're vulnerable to another peak. While the idea of waiting for a vaccine using our approach may be a good one, but still create a strong trade-off between the economy and health. The economy cost can be extremely high, only reduce if, again, suggest. I think I should stop here, and for time reason. And I encourage you, as you see, this is a platform. We are incorporating quite a bit of analysis. We use it to think about this structural thing, but so far, to our unpleasant surprise, we still think we are on top of thinking what's going on better than competing exercises. So we'll see what more the epidemiologists will have to tell us in the next few months.